Hi, so this is a recording I'm making for the benefit of my students. Um, we're covering part two of TMS, uh, and I'm going to be away. So someone else is going to lead a discussion at the usual place at the usual time, but I won't be present. I'm making this video as a kind of flipped classroom where I'm going to give remarks on part two. And the classroom itself, the class discussion itself, will be your opportunity to look at it in more detail and to explore it with each other. Part two is called, by the way, this is pages 67 to 108. So about 42 pages, I guess. Um, the part two is titled Of Merit and Demerit, or of the objects of reward and punishment. And it's about merit and demerit. Now, last time in class, this will have been two times ago once you watch this or discuss this video, but we discussed one of the secrets of Smith's book, which is the four sources of moral approval. And source one was taking the point of view of Jim, the actor whose action we are judging, forming a moral judgment about. We take kind of the point of view of Jim's motives, Jim's intentions and motives. Those are closely related. And source two takes the point of view of those who feel the consequences of Jim's action, the people, in a sense, on whom Jim acts. So if Jim does something that affects Mary, source two takes kind of Mary's point of view, checks in with Mary, as it were, and looks and sees, well, how does Mary feel about this? What are her sentiments? Okay. And what is the effect on Mary? We might see that it affects Mary in ways that Mary doesn't see that it affects Mary, but still, that would be sort of source two. So, and then there are sources three and four, which I won't recapitulate. Now, another secret I'll let you in on now is that the four sources of moral approval actually have a correspondence to the first parts, the first four parts of this book. We have just finished part one, and part one was about propriety. That's the propriety of Jim's motives, intentions in taking the action. Okay. This now is about the merit and demerit, and the focus is really on consequences of Jim's action, particularly in a kind of equal relationship where we're seeing the consequences on other individuals that are affected in a sort of micro context. So you see, part one is kind of about source one, part two is kind of focused on source two, part three is arguably focused on source three, and part four on source four. So that's a pretty interesting thing. It's kind of like the first four parts that, in a sense, give a broad statement, and then the further parts of the book are kind of embellishments, wrinkles, and so on, developments. Okay, now we're dealing with a step here then from sort of the source one to source two, propriety, as it were, to merit. You got propriety, impropriety here. You got merit, demerit here. And I'm going to let you in on more secrets right now. One secret is that as Smith works through this discussion of merit, he kind of builds it gradually. And subsequently it gets refined in our pages for today. And whereas he talks basically about kind of motives here and then consequences here, other words for consequences here could be results or outcomes. That as he develops this discussion about results and outcomes, or really the discussion of this distinction between these two, motives, intentions, results, outcome, effects over here. He starts with a kind of simple distinction and it gets a little bit more refined. And I think kind of the most refined it gets is on page 92, where he actually in the first paragraph there now of section 3 of this part says, whatever praise or blame can be due to any action must belong either first to the intention or affection of the human heart from which it proceeds. Second, to the external action or movement of the body, which this affection gives occasion to. And lastly, to the good or bad consequences. Okay, so you got the first and the third here as being the intention and the consequences, right? But you've also now got this piece in the middle, the external action or movement of the body, which this affection gives occasion to. And so you've actually got it more complicated. And is that so you intend to do something and yet your body doesn't successfully execute what you, let's say, intended. Okay. So is that non-execution by your body, of your body, part of your, like, does that mean that the intention wasn't really what we're supposing it was? Or is that part over here? Or do you put that over here with the consequences? In other words, this piece in the middle, the second piece, the external action or movement of the body, do you see that more as part of intention? Or do you see that, or do you group it this way and see that as part of consequence? That's a fuzzy issue, a difficult issue, and that kind of toggling is partly part of the theme of this whole issue of toggling that we have in this distinction between intentions and consequences, or intentions and results. We've got, of course, this is a major theme in economics where we talk about unintended consequences. We say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So you can get bad outcomes from good intentions. You can also get good outcomes from not so praiseworthy intentions, like, say, greed, just for example. So this is all getting at all this, obviously. And so, yeah, 92 provides this nice subtlety where you've got the piece in the middle and you don't know whether to put that more with intentions or more with the consequences. Now let me tell you some other secrets. One secret about TMS, generally speaking, is that a lot of these distinctions are sort of like points of view. They're sort of angles, approaches to enter into an exploration, a contemplation, say about the morality of Jim's actions. And the point of view might be about entering here, but when you enter, you find that it winds over to here. So you can't really fully assess here in certain respects without actually broaching or touching or intersecting, penetrating over here. Okay. So you find that these are connected once you get into the architecture, okay, or the system. And that's one point of view approaching here. Okay. Another point of view approaches here. Source one, Jim's intentions, Jim's motives, Jim's affections as he takes the action. But when you get into that, you feel that you have to think about what Jim understands his action to be. And part of that is to understand what Jim thinks the consequences are going to be. And so you end up going over here. And so these different distinctions are really distinctions in sort of entry points in a way, or approaches. They don't necessarily lead to opposite conclusions, and they're not distinct alternatives for getting to an answer. I mean, there might be, you might regard them as distinct entry points, but that doesn't mean that once you enter and properly explore, you come up with something that's distinct from if you had entered over here. You can enter a building from different doors, but it's still just one building, right? And that's very general about Smith. You often find that these topics, what he's really doing is exploring or describing, he's helping you with different doorways, different lenses, you might say, that all end up building towards an integrated kind of outlook on the whole. And so this very topic for today about intentions and consequences, results, outcomes, it kind of really very much parallels a very big distinction you might make, or that does get made in ethics, between, well, duties. Deons is the Greek word for that, or deontology. What is good conduct? What is your duty? What are the principles of good conduct? Okay. Versus another kind of entry point into ethics and judging actions is consequences, right? Effects, results. Never mind so much about the intention. What happens as a result? So that kind of parallels what is happening here, looking just at Jim's behavior and Jim's intentions versus the consequences of Jim's action. It is two approaches to ethics, which you can think of as about good conduct. What constitutes good conduct, like the principles of good conduct, the duties, the deons, the properness, the proprieties of good conduct, versus the consequences of good conduct, consequentialism. So this is sort of consequentialism and deontology. I won't say versus. I see them again as two different entry points. It's not about being in different buildings, actually, because they end up working together. I sometimes use the metaphor of each being a wing of ethics. And if you want to fly, you have to have two wings, right? Think about it. You can't really fly with one wing. And so these are the two wings of ethics. If you like, good conduct and consequences, or another way to put that is the good of the whole. So good conduct, good of the whole. This is what I call the correspondence between the two goods. Good conduct, good of the whole. And you could also say, therefore, the correspondence, the presumption of correspondence between deontology and consequentialism. Now, so this is, I kind of see this in what Smith's doing, because you can just see him playing with all of this. And that's very much my view, that it's not really about one or the other. It turns out to be about both. The word for good conduct, the general word I like to use over here, kind of like this question over here, is beneficialness, like beneficialness in God Joy's view, beneficialness for the whole, the good of the whole, the beneficialness of an action on the whole. And that's netting things out. It's not just looking at benefits, it's looking at the benefits and the losses, the hurts and the harms overall. And what's most beautiful when you look at the total effect, as Ronald Coase use. You put the term total effect. So this, step from part one to part two that we're making relates to this whole, good conduct, good of the whole step or relationship. And what Smith says is that, I mean, he looks at this approach, looking at now at consequences, but he does say that when you take this approach, you do end up having to look back at motives, and you take into consideration effects, whether intended or not, but you don't just judge Jim on those effects, you also judge him on his consequences, and therefore judging the merit of Jim's action is a compound, he says, a compounded, I think, sentiment. It's not just the or compounded. He says, this is page 74, paragraph 2. The sense of merit seems to be a compounded sentence. On page 74, paragraph 2, and then on the next page, in paragraph 5, he again says it seems to be a compounded sentiment, meaning that you do end up thinking about the motives of the agent, although you're like focused on the effects, or you've started on the effects of the agent. So it's not really like you do this and you get an answer, and then you do this and you get a completely separate analysis and answer, and then you add the two up or something. It's more like they're different ways of approaching the one large topic of the goodness, the rightness, the worthiness of Jim's action. So just to kind of now flip through from the beginning, from page 67, he starts talking about motives versus consequence in paragraph 2. And I'm going to just try to do this. I'm not trying to do this textually thoroughly at all. I don't mean this for this to be a very long. And then when he says, when we think about consequences or effects or results, he says that when we see someone receiving positive consequences or benefits, we feel that ought to prompt reward for the person, the benefit for the first person creating the benefits, and therefore inspire a feeling of gratitude. Okay, and when it's a negative punishment, it prompts us to return punishment, and the sentiment for that is resentment. So now looking here, we're kind of focusing here on the consequences approach, and the gratitude and resentment. So you see, Jim Smith is saying we kind of take the point of view of the Mary who's affected here and consider how she might feel gratitude or resentment, and kind of partly judge Jim's action based sort of cueing off of what Mary seems to feel about it. Besides talking about gratitude and resentment, he also talks about, lower down on 68, liking and disliking. And then the disliking is also called hatred when it's stronger feeling. And this gets a little bit into this issue about passive and active sentiments. You might call the one emotions and the other passions. And he's saying that we might feel hatred towards something, and even therefore in a passive way, like wish ill on it, but it doesn't necessarily move us to return, hurt for hurt, insult for insult. It's only when we feel that active impulse that we really call it resentment. So on page 69, paragraph 6, resentment would prompt us to desire not only that he should be punished, but that he should be punished by our means, and upon account of that particular injury which he had done us. Resentment cannot be fully gratified unless the offender is not only made to grieve in his turn, but to grieve for that particular wrong which we have suffered from him. Okay, so he's got like a sense of the full sense of resentment and as well the full sense of gratitude. He goes into that in the next chapter, chapter 2 here, starting on 69, and that goes on for like 3 pages. And he's saying these kinds of things I'm saying, and he comes back to this, and I'm going to jump to this right now. And that is, he comes back to this on page 94, when he's actually in the next section of the part, and he starts talking about proper, like if in paragraph 3. First line of paragraph 3 on page 94, he speaks of the proper object of gratitude or resentment. Notice that was the title of chapter 2 back on page 69. So you see that this is a real revisiting. And in this paragraph, this chapter here, he comes on page 96 to give a pretty interesting summary, again, where he's kind of refined what he has been saying. And so I'm just kind of pointing you to the distillment here rather than walking all the way through everything that gets here. So on paragraph 6, he says, before anything, therefore, can be the complete and proper object, either of gratitude or resentment, it must possess 3 different qualifications. First, it must be the cause of the pleasure in the one case and pain in the other. Second, it must be capable of feeling those sensations. And third, it must not only have produced those sensations, but it must have produced them from design, and from a design that is approved of in the one case, gratitude, and disapproved of in the other case, resentment. Okay, so here's again where he kind of gives a fuller statement. So I'll move back here to page 71. I know I'm jumping around, but it's all, I'm treating to some extent this is together. Um, this is now chapter 3 on page 71. And he's going over and illustrating that where there is no approbation of the conduct of the person who confers the benefit, there is little sympathy with the gratitude of him who receives it. So in other words, if somebody gets benefited by somebody, we don't necessarily enter into that gratitude. He gives the example, for example, of a vain noble who discovers that some, poor person who actually has no actual apparent kin relationship to him has the same last name. And so for that reason, the noble somehow confers on the guy wealth or title. I don't remember exactly what the example says. It just kind of to serve his vanity that his name should be kind of associated with wealth or something. And the poor guy who receives this benefit might feel grateful, but Smith says, we don't really agree with the motive of the giver, the benefiter here. And so we don't really enter into his gratitude. So we can reject the feelings of the person affected, but we're doing so by saying this is what a person affected would properly feel, should properly feel. And so again, there's sympathy, but in a sense, it's with an elusive or imaginary recipient now of the benefit. So it's still the organon with sympathy, but it's not with the actual person. It's with an elusive or imaginary person. And so he's illustrating this about if we don't agree with the motive, we really can't go necessarily the motive of the creator of the effect. We can't necessarily into the gratitude or resentment of the recipient of the effect. And then in page 73, he gives some recapitulation. I think I'll just turn, and yeah, I'll turn the page for this. Another thing is like when he says, like with a dead person, that when he's been dead and killed, we obviously don't have a sympathy with him now that he's been murdered, let's say very unjustly, viciously murdered, because he's dead. He doesn't have a sentiment. But we have this elusive sentiment about how he would feel that punishment is due. Okay. I know that his family and people like that who suffer the loss also feel that, but even without them, we might feel on his behalf in a kind of imaginary way. So anyhow, all right. So yeah, on page 74, he talks about it being a compounded sentiment, like I indicated. And so we need actually to go back and feel that the motives or intentions were for the effects that we're tallying, that we're reporting or observing. Um, more or less. I mean, so we can't have someone intending to do one thing, having an effects that's totally different, and then giving him credit or punishment for these totally different effects if they're completely contrary to what he had intended, right? Um, we get into this issue of the correspondence between what a person intends and what a person actually creates or causes. Causes is, I guess, the right word. Now, on page 76, there is a very long footnote that starts. And this footnote goes on for, it spills onto 3 pages here. It's in small print and it's very long. It's very unusual for Smith to have this kind of long footnote, and it's by no means clear to me why this is arranged as such, why this material isn't more properly integrated into the main text. He goes off and what he seems to first do in paragraphs 7, 8, and I think 9 of this footnote here, is talk more about these issues of gratitude and resentment, kind of along the lines we've been saying, I think. And he's saying basic things, which I think he's kind of already he's already kind of said, and so I don't know why it's not more integrated. I mean, it starts off with him saying, like, some people are against resentment, as though we shouldn't have resentment. This is a little bit like people today suggesting we shouldn't have hate. And so he kind of then just revisits what he's been saying with this, I guess, point in mind, or this contention in mind, a contention which he disagrees with. And what he says is, yes, it's true that resentment, I think he says like 99 out of 100 cases goes overboard, like a person doesn't tamp it down enough. And so, we should have a very skeptical view of strong actions or expressions of resentment. And you might say the same about hate, certainly. But again, remember, for him, hate is not necessarily so active. Resentment kind of implies that active hate, if you will, maybe flows into revenge. So what he's saying is, look, even though 99 out of 100 times perhaps we feel, and it does go too far, it doesn't mean 100 out of 100. And that, in fact, we need this sense in us, and it's a natural counterpart in the whole system of morals. I mean, resentment is the counterpart to gratitude, he says in paragraph 7. And God didn't make a mistake in implanting this in us, is what he is saying, or gets to. It's very important for people standing up for what they feel is right, not letting themselves be walked all over, tread upon, don't tread on me. Um, because if they didn't have this thing implanted with them that impels them to kind of, punish and revenge things, correct things, rectify things, and do, like he said, like make the guide learn the lesson, or and therefore make others learn the lesson, that you can't do that. And if you do it, you're going to suffer in certain ways. And by the way, the public expression of disapproval can be, you can think of as a form of punishment. It's, again, it's hard to draw lines here, but it's not just about, an eye for an eye. It's also about reprimanding, reproving, condemning, boycotting, and so on. Because, people don't like to be disapproved of or hated or blamed, even if they're not going to jail, they don't like it. Even if they're not being fined or whipped, they don't like it. So he then, in this long footnote, in paragraph 10, well, he says some interesting things, but what he's getting at here is that this tendency of ours to want to punish harm and injury, this sense of resentment, is implanted in us by nature for good reason, because we need it. And he says that he's suggesting, I do not believe that this sentiment of resentment, right, even an instinct for resentment, came out of people having first thought just about consequences and about why it would be good to punish wrongdoers. And therefore, they said, let's have a sentiment of resentment to get us to punish wrongdoers. He is saying that it more evolved from our nature, like God made us this way. The great director of nature, he says at the top of 78, God, because we needed this, and because we didn't have reason way back when in band man world. We didn't even have language, right? And language and reason, and thinking through the consequences of things, complex things, go together. So that's what he's saying there through paragraph 10, basically. And then in paragraph 11, he makes this point again about elusiveness, that it's not necessarily what Mary, the recipient, the person affected, necessarily actually feels sentimentally about gratitude or resentment. It's kind of like what we think someone in Mary's situation should feel, given what Jim did. And so he uses this term elusive sympathies, okay, towards the end of paragraph 11. Okay. Now, we're going to come back, like we have already indicated, to this whole issue of motive and consequences. But what comes next in the text is what you've already seen before, which is now really his turn towards the distinction between commutative justice and the other social virtues, which are here headed under the broad title of beneficence. You might broadly think of this as the matter of distributive justice, making a becoming use of what is your own. Proper beneficence would be virtuous beneficence. Proper beneficence is distributive justice. And I'm not going to go through this again because we talked about it, but he starts off talking about beneficence, and then says it's like this, it's like that, like we've talked about. And then he says, well, there's another virtue, however, which is also about your effect on other people. So it's sort of this part 2 topic. that's not like beneficence in important ways. This virtue is justice. This is paragraph 5 again. This virtue is justice. And he starts to unfold the ways in which justice is different from beneficence. I have created we've talked about this already, but let's see here. Yeah, I just got to move this thing if I can. Here, I've put up at the figures page. This is not in your packet because I just put this up today, but this is just page 22 of the Green Book. And this is that list of ways in which CJ is special relative to the other virtues. Main thing is precise and accurate. And then these other things that we talked about that really kind of are correlates or corollaries of it being precise and accurate. And Smith is developing these. I'm not gonna spell them out again and so on. And I won't dwell also on how this discussion is mainly like the whole book originally was mainly focused on equal equal, EE as I call it. And you see that he says among equals twice in paragraph 7, just to make it clear there. And then he does the turnout to say, hey, listen, what I'm saying about equals doesn't necessarily go for the superior in relation to the inferior. This here is jural superior in relation to the jural inferior, just as the EE is jural equal to jural equal, you and your neighbor, you and Novak Djokovic, you and anyone else who's actually very great and superior in many ways, but is just a jural equal, right? So this is now paragraph 8, the superior inferior relationship. We've talked about this. It's a very important turnout here, and I won't go over it again. And then it finishes, and then he starts in paragraph 9, and he's back to equal, right in the first sentence. He says from equals to signal that the turnout is finished, and he's back to EE. That is sort of the center of the book. Not to say that SI doesn't get treated to some extent or referred to, but it's, he's back to his main bailiwick, EE. And we talked about on 82 how there's kind of a discussion of what commutative justice covers, and the one on the top of 82 mentions reputation, whereas when we come to 84, in the last sentence of paragraph 2, the most sacred laws of justice, person, property, promises due, no mention of reputation. Okay. We'll go over that again. And I think I want to go back. We talked on page 85 and 86 as well. That's about these different cases. One where everybody is really good in distributive justice and beneficence, is loving and wonderful and everything. And everyone is drawn to one common center of mutual good offices, are the words that finish paragraph 1. And then there's no beneficence, but there is commutative justice. And as long as people are not messing with each other's stuff, society can still subsist. It won't be very beautiful or lovely, but it doesn't fall apart. And then there's the case where you don't even have that, where neighbors are readily messing with each other's stuff, and their society falls apart. Hence, CJ is indispensable, one of the items on this list right here. Somewhere's in here. So, and then he gives this example or this analogy in paragraph 4 that we mentioned, where beneficence is like the ornament of a building, where CJ is the pillar that upholds the whole edifice. And if you don't have the pillar, the building is going to fall. And this, I think, is a sound enough statement. I mean, that without CJ among equals, your building is going to fall. But something that is curious is that Smith states this so starkly as though you could have zero beneficence, or if you like, zero DJ, although zero DJ other than CJ violation, bad DJ, okay? What I'm saying is actually elsewhere in the book, Smith indicates that if DJ or beneficence is really low, CJ starts falling apart. So the point is, you can't actually have CJ well preserved and zero DJ. He's kind of assuming a case that cannot exist. You see? Now, I don't think creates a big trouble. I just think it's a kind of ironic thing. I think it's something he's doing intentionally. I think it relates to a method that he's actually employing to get us to think about these extreme cases, and therefore about the circumstantiality or the boundedness of the relationships between variables that we're talking about, and that they don't go for the whole range of the variables. We're not even sure what it means to have zero DJ or zero beneficence. How could you even have society if you have zero beneficence, right? So I think he's very aware. He's prompting us to think about the limits actually on our reasonings, I would say. Mhm. Now, here, when we continue on page 87, let me just remind you that this is all what I said about the three cases, the pillar, the ornament. All of this is just the start of this chapter of the utility of this constitution of nature. So in other words, the utility of this constitution of us having these feelings of resentment for injury or hurt. And so then he's getting into, in these very, very interesting pages that follow, and that in fact finish the section, about the utility of these very strong feelings about proper conduct, about good conduct, about what's right. So in other words, the utility of these very strong feelings about deons, about duties, okay? And this is extremely interesting. And I don't think I really need to get into it. I'm going to let you guys discuss it. But basically here you can kind of see, I guess there is a little bit I want to discuss. But basically what you can see here is he's saying we need to think about, I think he's implying anyway, that we need to think about both. And again, he's making the divine providence point that God made us care about certain things because we could not foresee or understand the consequences of certain actions. In other words, we didn't know that we needed to invent a sense of propriety, so he gave it to us instinctually. If he had never given it to us instinctually, we never would have gotten to the point of reasoning and talking enough to figure out that we needed to have an instinct for it. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, it's not something that we kind of finally discovered and therefore made a very strong tradition or custom. It's something that it was much more native to us. And this whole matter of, if you will, deontology and consequentialism, it gets brought up here when he talks about, for example, if somebody's cheated out of a guinea, this is on page 89, paragraph 10, is he going to fuss? Is he going to fuss about having been, let's say, shortchanged by a guinea? And I forget exactly what a guinea is, but it's not a lot of money. It's some small, it's part of I don't remember if it's a pound or what it is, but whatever it is, it's not necessarily, it might be quite costly to rectify being shortchanged. You might not realize it till you get home, and it might be a long way back to the store, and it's going to be a fuss, and it's going to be then a claim on your part. Hey, you only gave me this much. Oh, really? Says and so on. And so, do you bother with it? Um, I think this is the kind of flavor of the example. And he's saying, look, if people never worried about being shortchanged, then they could be shortchanged a lot. And if it's done a lot, you might lose 1,000 guineas, right? Um, and so is it that you care about the 1,000 guineas, and therefore, as a large consequence, you worry about the single guinea to protect the 1,000 guineas? So is it only for the sake of the 1,000 guineas that we care about the individual? In other words, is it only about the whole that we care about the individual? And what he's saying is yes and no, actually, as I read it in a way. And I see him affirming again that you need to have this very strong sense of, if you like, a duty, a kind of natural right, even for protecting the individual or the single guinea. And you need a sense of what's good for the whole. And you've got to make these two things dovetail, even by sometimes compromising on the individual rights or refining just when exactly it is a right, or when some other, or when you might say it's a right, but not an absolute right. It's a right that another right can actually, encroach upon, can affect, or trump. Um, so, right doesn't necessarily mean an absolute dispositive right about what your disposition about some issue should be. It could be just something to put in the balance and to regard as a kind of sacred right, but rights are presumptive. They're claims. They're not absolute axioms necessarily. You have to always kind of go back and be ready to think about the big picture. And so he gives this, in terms of like intentions here. He gives this very interesting example of the sentinel. This is in paragraph 11 on page 90. The sentinel, that is to say, kind of the watcher, the scout in the military, the guy who's standing guard, kind of keeping a sentry, keeping an eye out. He spells it with a C here, sentinel, but I think we would spell it with an S, or sentry, who's, on the lookout. And if he sees some trouble, is going to blow his whistle, like the enemy's coming. They're surprise attacking us, right? And so he says a sentinel, for example, who falls asleep upon his watch suffers death by the laws of war, because such a carelessness might endanger the whole army. So is it wrong to put the sentinel to death? He fell asleep on his watch. It turns out nothing happened. All that was discovered is that I'll put this off for the moment. All that happened is that he fell asleep, and no army came, and there was no harm actually that came to anybody. So is it just to put the guy to death? The guy fell asleep. Like, if the guy hadn't been caught sleeping, he wouldn't have been put to death. In other words, no one came by and noticed that he was sleeping. He wouldn't have been put to death, and no one else would have been any worse off. It would, yeah, if for some reason, he wasn't discovered sleeping. He says this severity may, upon many occasions, appear necessary, and for that reason, just and proper. Listen to this next sentence, very quotable. When the preservation of an individual is inconsistent with the safety of a multitude, nothing can be more just than that the many should be preferred to the one. So when the good of the individual is inconsistent with the good of the whole, you do step on the good of the individual. Okay. And that could mean stepping on his liberty, by the way. Don't be so dogmatically or axiomatically libertarian as to preclude that possibility. But clearly, just in terms of ethics, in terms of, the well-being of the individual and the well-being of the whole is supreme. This is the supremacy of the whole, the good of the whole. Again, when the preservation of an individual is inconsistent with the safety of a multitude, nothing can be more just than that the many should be preferred to the one. And so yet, people often don't punish. And what he's saying is, look, if we don't punish sentinels who fall asleep, they'll fall asleep more. They'll know that we're going to let it slide. And then if they fall asleep more, the enemy will know that we're not so alert and will attack more. And so the whole unit will be in the whole country, because, these things grow and can lead to bad outcomes. And so there is reason to maintain this very strict discipline of putting the guy to death, even though nothing happened that particular night. And so these are different points of view. And, he's not pretending to have a very, that everything comes to a clear resolution. This is beyond commutative justice, what the rule for a sleeping sentry should be, what the military's rule, and whether that rule should be maintained, is beyond, just not messing with other people's stuff. And so don't pretend that it's precise and accurate. It's not. These are things get. And so he's saying that he says that anyhow, injury needs to be punished. Sometimes even non-injury that risks injury needs to be punished. We feel that in our heart. And even if our institutions don't ensure that, which he says we hope that they will properly in a proper way, he says we have the notion that they will be punished or rewarded in the afterlife. Okay. And this is the last sentence, last paragraph of this section. And he ends up by saying, in every religion and in every superstition that the world has ever beheld, this is paragraph 12 on page 91, in every religion and in every superstition, there has been a Tartarus. I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, the Roman idea of hell, as well as an Elysium, the Roman idea of heaven, a place provided for the punishment of the wicked, as well as one for the reward of the just. And so we have this very strong notion about certain things calling for punishment, therefore giving, therefore a feeling of resentment, and some things reward, hence gratitude. Okay. So that's that. And then there's another section, which I'm going to talk about right now. And this is related, but it's kind of a peculiarly and interestingly framed. I'm not going to go over it in detail. And in fact, I'm not going to give away the secret. What I kind of see as the secret here that kind of is given in the last chapter of this section. But I don't think he makes it as clear as he might have, in fact. And so I'm not going to necessarily, I'm going to maybe leave you to explore that, to explore that in class. I don't want to say too much about that. So, or about this, I don't want to spend too much time on this section right now, but I do want to kind of give you the setup. So on page 92, it starts off by him giving this three-part dissection, which I shared with you earlier. First, there's the intention or affection of Jim. Second is the external action or movement of the body, which this affection gives occasion to, which this affection causes Jim to do. And lastly, to the good or bad consequences for the whole, which proceed from it. And so again, you've got the motive, you've got the consequences, and you've got this piece in the middle, the external action or movement of the body. And what Smith says next is, look, folks, we all know, he seems to say, he kind of presumes, we all know that mere luck shouldn't play a role in judging Jim. Like we don't praise Jim for being lucky, and we don't fault Jim for being unlucky. And what matters is his intention, what he means to do, what he sets out to do. And that should be the only thing that matters. That should be the only thing that matters, really. Why should we let fortune, why should we let luck play a role at all? Isn't it really just this? I mean, you don't want to say Jim is good because he got lucky. You don't want to say Jim is bad because he got unlucky. So shouldn't it really just be about this, our moral judgment? And he seems to say, Smith seems to kind of say here, yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. It should really be about this. But when we look around and we experience life and we observe, in fact, our own moral judgments, we find that this consequences does play a significant role. Look, this and we let consequences play a role, and therefore we let luck or fortune play a role. Because after all, luck or fortune, however you want to call it, partly determines the consequences. We look at the consequences, and we do in fact let that influence our judgment of Jim's action, right? And consequences proceed partly from luck or unluck or lack of luck. And so, in fact, we don't live up to this idea that we just base it on this. So the fact that we let consequences affect our moral sentiment about Jim's action, he calls in paragraph 6 an irregularity of sentiment. That our sentiment, our moral sentiment, it has this irregularity of letting consequences play a role. Okay? And so this is the setup for the whole section, this so-called irregularity. Okay? Let me push upward. I mean, let me go back a little bit, just a couple paragraphs here on page 93. I think that this sentence here in paragraph 3, the last sentence of paragraph 3 might be a useful one to point out. To the intention or affection of the heart, therefore, to the propriety or impropriety, to the beneficence or hurtfulness of the design, that's the intention, all praise or blame, all approbation or disapprobation of any kind, which can justly be bestowed upon an action, must ultimately belong. See, so it should be really based on this. And, we shouldn't let this, which involves luck, get in the way of a proper judgment of this. Okay, that's kind of, but we do let consequences affect us. Okay. And so when he says how he then talks about why it is he talks some about why it is or he raises the issue, really, I guess you could say. He raises the issue of why it is that we let fortune play this role, why there is this irregularity of sentiment. And here again, he gets into, well, we seem to feel gratitude when we feel benefited, when we feel benefits from things. And that's kind of the basis for letting outcomes affect us. And we seem to feel resentment and therefore moral disapproval or hatred for things that harm us. And that seems to be, again, the basis for letting the consequences affect us. And he makes his point, he does this verse with the positive things, benefits, like in paragraph 2. Well, in paragraph 1, he does it with the negative, where he says the child, like a dog who is angry or bites somebody, um, um, the child beats it. A dog barks. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What he says here is, I'm sorry, it's the stone. He says we are excited by inanimated as well as animated objects. We are angry for a moment, even at the stone that hurts us. A child beats it. A dog barks at it. A choleric man is apt to curse it. Damn stone, that kind of thing. But obviously, it's not really proper to feel resentment at the stone, okay? Yet we do, okay? And then he turns it around to the positive in paragraph 2, a much more pleasant and kind of charming paragraph with a whole bunch of wonderful examples, which I won't go into, but it's very much about us growing fond of the things that we've benefited from and are accustomed to benefiting from and feeling almost grateful to them. Let me read a little bit of this. The house which we have long lived in, the tree whose verdure and shade we have long enjoyed, are both looked upon with a sort of respect that seems due to such benefactors. Okay. And then he speaks of people thinking about ancient fairies and genies and such that they imagined inhabited the woods, and that would be therefore maybe agents and objects of resentment or gratitude. But then he goes into what are the proper objects of resentment and gratitude, and we've talked a bit about this. And he comes again on page 96 to this 3-part breakdown, and it's got to be like kind of intended and uh, and so on. And so it's not really proper to feel grateful to the tree outside whose verdure I've long enjoyed. I mean, I can kind of love the tree, don't get me wrong, but to be a fully proper object of gratitude, the tree didn't intend to benefit me. The tree is an inanimate object. It doesn't will benefiting me. It doesn't really will very much of anything, you might say. And so is it a proper object? No, but we nonetheless let the connection between benefit, actual consequential benefit or harm, affect this moral judgment. Okay, that's essentially what he's saying there. And then he illustrates it very richly. This is, again, really a lot of fun. He illustrates it, and he works through basically four categories. And this is the subject here of your extra credit assignment for this section. It's particularly about this chapter, this extra credit assignment, chapter 2. And we have a 2x2 here. One row is fortune arrests, that is to say, blocks or gets in the way of intended consequences, which would have been either beneficial or hurtful. And then the next row is fortune gives rise to unintended consequences that are beneficial, hurtful. Okay. And he illustrates each of these four categories. You could think of this as a taxonomy of situations based on these two distinctions. I just wrote out the nature of these distinctions right here. I say I just did this because I just posted this to the figures page on the website. Again, this figure is not in your printed handout. And so your homework assignment is to say what are the paragraphs devoted to each of these four sections, and what is one or two or more of the illustrations. And there's a bunch of lovely illustrations given here. And again, they can go positive or negative. They can go either lucky or unlucky. A bad guy, meaning something negative, meaning to harm somebody, can be lucky or unlucky in achieving, that is to say, in achieving his design. Like, for example, if someone means to kill somebody, but something stops him from doing so, something out of pure luck. Well, should we consider him guilty of murder even though no one died? It's a little bit like the Sentinel. Or what about when a guy shoots somebody and kills somebody, but he was shooting at a bear or shooting at a deer, and the bullet went by and it hit another hunter on the other side of the woods and kills him. He killed the guy, right? And his bodily movement shot the trigger and all that, but he certainly didn't intend to. At least that's what I'm supposing. He didn't intend to. But nonetheless, we let these outcomes, which again depend partly on luck, affect our moral judgment. So that's what Smith's illustrating here in these wonderful illustrations. And then he comes, it's a rather long chapter, that one, but it's a fun one, and it's not too philosophically challenging. And then he comes to kind of his resolution of this so-called irregularity of sentiment. And that's this last chapter, chapter 3. And he kind of gives the answer, but I don't think he puts it quite as plainly as he might have. I've got my own way of putting it, but I'm not going to share that here. I'll hope that it kind of emerges in the course discussion. And so it's kind of a fun and interesting last chapter there. Yeah, so think about it. Now, as I conclude here, I just realized that there's one thing in this whole selection for today that I neglected to comment on. And that's something that now comes back at the end of section 2 of this part 2. So page 91. Now, I should maybe should have said this when we were at this point, but it's not a big deal. I mean, because I don't mean to say very much, but there's something significant here in the textual notes. And that is that the editors are sharing with us the an extract, something that was taken out of the 6th edition. And that, let me see here. I am recording, right? Yeah, I'm recording. So in the last edition of 1790, he took out this stuff that's down here in the small text on the bottom of page 91 and the bottom of page 92. So it's a lengthy thing here. This has a much more not only religious overtone to it, but specifically Christian overtone to it. He even speaks of the atonement or some other atonement um, being necessary for certain things that he's talking about. And then he says the doctrines, this is at the very end, the doctrines of revelation coincide in every respect. And he's clearly meaning the Christian doctrines of revelation. So Christian scripture, the New Testament, with those original anticipations of nature, and as they teach us how little we can depend upon the imperfection of our own virtue, so they show us at the same time that the most powerful intercession has been made. That's referring to Christ. And that the most dreadful atonement, that's the crucifixion, has been paid for our manifold transgressions and inquiries. So this is a very explicitly Christian reference. It's an explicit, I mean, it doesn't put it exactly in these words, but it's a clear reference to Christ and the crucifixion, the incarnation and the crucifixion. Um, and he took these out in the final edition. This deletion figures into the issues about, well, just how religious or just how Christian was Adam Smith? Why did he make those kind of changes? And this is one change which people who see him as more like Hume, David Hume, that is to say, more like an agnostic, because I don't think it's proper to call David Hume an atheist. Um, they'll point to this as like supporting their case. But there are other things, and even things that happened in the sixth edition, which do go the other way. Eric Madsen has written about this, and to some extent, he's actually pushed back on the idea that the changes to the sixth edition clearly point in the direction of him being more like Hume rather than being more seriously religious or Christian. But it's a very notable thing because even if this had been the only really totally explicit reference to Christ or the crucifixion in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it got removed in the sixth edition. All right, well, that I hope this works. I'll put it up and yeah, see ya. Bye.